Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was born with Doomsday's power instead of One for All. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. Excerpt from Omega Crisis, Issue 4, page 17. Publisher, Mono Comics, defunct, pre-quirk era. Panel 1, a massive, gray, bony creature, its body a tapestry of spikes and hardened plates, stands over the broken form of a caped hero. The art is stark, using heavy inks and dramatic shadows. The creature is pure, unthinking rage. Narration Box 1, they called it the ultimate life form. A weapon engineered in the unforgiving crucible of a dead world, a place where life was a fleeting mistake. Its purpose was singular and absolute, to overcome all opposition. Narration Box 2, its biology was a terrifying paradox. To defeat it was to teach it. To wound it was to strengthen it. To kill it was to make it perfect. Panel 2, a close-up on the creature's red, hate-filled eyes. There is no cunning, no malice. Only a biological imperative. Narration Box 3, every death was a lesson etched into its very DNA. It would resurrect, its body rewriting its own code to nullify the method of its demise. Drown it, and it would learn to breathe water. Burn it, and its hide would become fireproof. Break it, and its bones would regrow like steel. It was not alive in the way we understood it. It was a cycle of death and escalating perfection, an engine of extinction. Narration Box 4, they called it Doomsday. The comic book was old, the pages yellowed and smelling of dust and time. A 4-year-old Izuku Midoriya traced the jagged lines of the creature with a chubby finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't understand the grim narrative, or the existential horror of the concept. He just saw a monster that got stronger every time it lost. To his simple, hero-obsessed mind, it was a fascinating, if scary, kind of superpower. He much preferred the smiling visage of All Might, whose comics were bright and full of hope, but the image of the gray monster, Doomsday, lodged itself in a quiet, forgotten corner of his developing mind. He put the comic back in the dusty box he'd found in the attic, the forgotten relic of a grandfather he never met. It was time to go to the doctor. It was time to find out what his quirk would be. The air in Dr. Tsubasa's office was sterile, smelling faintly of antiseptic and recycled air. It was a place of scientific certainty, of charts and data and concrete answers. Izuku sat on the crinkly paper of the examination table, kicking his little red shoes back and forth, his all-might action figure clutched tightly in one hand. His mother Inko sat beside him, a bundle of nervous energy, wringing her hands. "So, doctor?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "His quirk, has it manifested?" Dr. Tsubasa, a kind-faced man with large, round glasses, sighed and swiveled in his chair. He tapped a stylus against the screen displaying a complex series of biological scans. "Well, Mrs. Midoriya, your son's case is unusual." Izuku's kicking stopped. "Unusual? Was that good?" "Izuku here," the doctor continued, pointing to a scan showing Izuku's foot, lacks the extra joint in his pinky toe. "That's typical of the current generation, a clear sign that he possesses a quirk factor. The question is, what is it?" He pulled up another screen, this one a cellular analysis. "His genetic markers are off the charts. His cellular regeneration rate is extraordinary, almost instantaneous for minor cuts and scrapes. His bone density is already 20% higher than the average for a child his age, and his muscle fibers are denser, more tightly woven than any I've ever seen. It's as if his entire body is a coiled spring, just waiting for a trigger." Inko's eyes widened with a mixture of pride and confusion. "So he has a strength quirk? Like All Might?" "Not exactly," the doctor hedged, adjusting his glasses. "Strength quirks usually have an identifiable mechanism, pyrokinetics for muscle activation, kinetic energy storage, things like that. Izuku's body is just inherently powerful. There's no switch, no secondary energy source. It's just his baseline biology. We've labeled it for now as a stockpile-type regeneration quirk. The theory is that his body is constantly reinforcing itself, stockpiling durability and potential energy. But how he'll use it, or what its active component is, We have no idea. It could manifest as super strength, invulnerability, or perhaps something else entirely. We'll have to wait and see. Izuku's heart sank a little. It wasn't flashy like Kaken's explosions. He couldn't show it off in the playground. But the doctor said he was strong. That was enough. He could be a hero with a strong body. He smiled, holding up his action figure. I can be like All Might. The doctor offered a weak, slightly strained smile in return. He didn't voice his true concerns. The sheer, unbridled potential simmering in the boy's cells was unlike anything he'd ever documented. It was raw, primal, and utterly without a definable limit. It felt less like a quirk and more like a biological anomaly. For the next year, life was relatively normal. Izuku's quirk was invisible. He was stronger than the other kids, faster, and healed from scraped knees in minutes instead of days, but those were subtle things. To everyone else, especially to Katsuki Bakugo, he was still just Deku, the useless one who couldn't do anything cool. Their dynamic was that of a king and his most devoted, if clumsy, courtier. Bakugo, with his crackling, explosive power, was the center of their small universe. Izuku, with his quiet admiration and notebooks, orbited him faithfully. He trailed Bakugo and his friends through the woods and across playgrounds, content to be in the presence of someone he saw as the pinnacle of heroic potential. It was on a humid afternoon in late spring, the sky the color of a bruised plum before a storm, that everything changed. Bakugo led his small entourage to a creek on the outskirts of Muzurifu. Recent rains had turned the normally placid stream into a churning, muddy torrent. The water gurgled and hissed as it rushed over unseen rocks. Last one to the other side is a rotten egg, Bakugo declared, his voice full of unchallenged authority. He used small, precise explosions from his palms to hop from one slick, moss-covered rock to another, a perfect display of power and control. His two friends followed, more cautiously. Izuku, as always, was last. He was more careful, his analytical mind already calculating the slickest spots and the most stable-looking stones. He wanted to impress Kaken, to show him that even without a flashy quirk, he wasn't useless. He could keep up. He made it halfway across, his small body tensed with concentration. He could hear Bakugo laughing from the other side. Hurry up, Deku! Are you a snail? A flush of embarrassment and determination warmed Izuku's cheeks. He took a slightly bigger leap than he should have. His red shoe landed on a rock slick with algae. For a terrifying, weightless moment, he was suspended in the air. Then, his feet went out from under him. He fell backwards. The world became a blur of green trees and gray sky. There was a sharp, sickening thud as the back of his head connected with the unforgiving edge of a submerged rock. The sound was swallowed by the roar of the water. Bakugo stopped laughing. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a wide-eyed shock. He saw it. He saw the clumsy fall, heard the wet crack of impact. He saw Izuku's eyes go wide and then vacant. He saw his friend's limp body immediately swept away by the powerful current, tumbling head over heels in the brown water like a discarded doll. For a second, nobody moved. The other two boys just stared, their mouths agape. Deku? Bakugo whispered, his voice small. Then, the reality of the situation crashed down on him. Panic, cold and sharp, seized his chest. DKU! He screamed, his voice cracking. He scrambled along the riverbank, his sneakers sinking into the mud, his eyes frantically scanning the churning water. Izuku! But he was gone. There was no sign of him. The river had swallowed him whole. One of the other boys started crying. Bakugo felt a tremor start in his own hands, a feeling utterly alien to him. It wasn't the familiar, exciting thrum of his quirk building. It was fear. Pure, undiluted terror. He had seen him fall. He had seen him hit his head. He had seen him go under and not come back up. He had just watched Deku die. The hours that followed were a waking nightmare. The setting sun painted the sky in angry strokes of orange and red as the first responders arrived. The woods filled with the cacophony of sirens, shouting voices, and the frantic, heartbreaking sobs of his Auntie Inko. Bakugo sat on a log, wrapped in a coarse blanket by a paramedic, his own parents standing over him with worried expressions. He told them what happened, his voice a choked monotone. He'd replayed the moment 1,000 times in his head. The slip. The fall. The sound. The vacant eyes. He watched them bring in searchlights as darkness fell. He watched divers prepare to enter the treacherous water. He heard the somber, hushed tones of the police officers talking to Inko, their words gentle but laced with the grim finality of their profession. Recovery mission, one of them said. Not a rescue. The word echoed in Bakugo's mind. Recovery. You recover a body. Inko Midoriya collapsed at that, her legs giving out from under her. She knelt in the damp earth, her face buried in her hands, her grief a raw, physical thing that seemed to suck the very air out of the clearing. Mitsuki Bakugo, her own face pale, rushed to her friend's side, trying to offer comfort that couldn't possibly be enough. It was his fault. The thought hammered at Bakugo. He'd dared him. He'd called him slow. If he hadn't been showing off, if he had just waited, maybe Deku wouldn't have rushed. Maybe he wouldn't have slipped. He felt a profound, crushing weight settle upon his 5-year-old shoulders. He had killed his friend. The search continued for what felt like an eternity. The woods were a chaotic stage of flashing red and blue lights, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping monsters. The atmosphere was thick with despair, and then, a figure stumbled out of the tree-ling. It was small and unsteady, caked in mud from head to toe. Its green and black hair was matted with leaves and grime, its clothes torn and soaked through. For a moment, everyone froze. A police officer raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating the impossible. It was Izuku. He blinked against the sudden light, looking dazed and utterly bewildered. He took a few more clumsy steps forward before stopping, his eyes scanning the scene of flashing lights and tear-streaked faces with pure confusion. "Mom?" he asked, his voice raspy. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Inko's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a heartbeat, she was frozen, as if seeing a ghost. Then, a raw, primal sound tore from her throat, a cry of impossible joy and relief. "Izuku!" She scrambled to her feet and ran, nearly tripping over roots as she closed the distance. She threw her arms around her son, pulling him into an embrace so tight it was a wonder he could breathe. Her sobs now tears of overwhelming, hysterical gratitude. "Oh, my baby! My baby! You're alive! You're okay!" Paramedics rushed forward, shining penlights in his eyes and checking his pulse. Izuku just stood there, limp in his mother's arms, looking around at the chaos he had apparently caused. What happened?" he murmured, leaning his head against her shoulder. "I was by the creek. I think I fell. It's all fuzzy. I woke up in the woods. It was cold." A paramedic was gently probing the back of his head. "He's got a nasty bump here, but the skin's not broken. No signs of concussion, pupils are responsive. Vitals are, well, they're a little strange. Pulse is a bit slow but incredibly strong. Let's get him to the hospital for a full workup." Bakugo watched from his log, the blanket forgotten on the ground. His mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. It wasn't possible. He saw it. The rock. The way he went limp. No one could survive that. No one could survive hours in that freezing, violent river. As they led Izuku towards an ambulance, the boy's confused gaze met Bakugo's. Izuku offered a small, weak smile, as if to say, "Sorry for all the trouble." Bakugo didn't smile back. He just stared, his mind reeling. The other kids were celebrating, their parents hugging them tightly. But Bakugo wasn't relieved. He was terrified, because he knew a secret no one else did. The boy who had just walked out of the woods was not the same one who had fallen into the river. The boy who fell was gone. This was something else, something that had taken his place. The hospital cleared Izuku with a clean bill of health that baffled the doctors. Besides some minor hypothermia and a few scratches, he was perfectly fine. The large, dangerous-looking contusion on his head had faded to a mere pinkish mark by the next morning. When Dr. Tsubasa was called in to consult, his scans revealed something that made his blood run cold. Izuku Midoriya's bone density was now 40% higher than the average. His cellular structure had become even more resilient, his regenerative abilities more potent. It was as if his body, in response to a near-death experience, had decided to armor itself against blunt force trauma. The stockpile-type regeneration quirk wasn't just stockpiling. It was reacting. The official explanation given to Inko was a miraculous survival, a testament to the incredible resilience of his unique quirk. She accepted it, clinging to the joy of having her son back. But the world outside their apartment was no longer the same. The change began subtly. At school, the kids who had been with them at the creek gave him a wide berth. They would whisper when he walked by, their eyes full of a mixture of awe and fear. The definitive shift happened a week after the incident. Bakugo, who had been avoiding him entirely, finally cornered him behind the school during recess. He wasn't flanked by his usual cronies. He was alone, and his face was pale and serious. "Hey," Bakugo said, his voice lacking its usual arrogant bite. "Hi, Kaken," Izuku replied, hopeful. Maybe things could go back to normal. "You died," Bakugo stated, his voice flat. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "I saw you. Your head hit the rock, and you went into the water. You were gone." Izuku frowned, confused. "No, I didn't. I just fell. The doctor said my quirk protected me. I just got knocked out and woke up later." He had no memory of dying, just a fall, then a cold, dark nothingness, then the feeling of damp earth beneath him as he woke up. Bakugo's hands began to tremble, tiny pops of smoke escaping his fists. "Don't lie to me," he hissed, his fear finally giving way to anger. "I saw you. You weren't breathing. You were broken. So what are you? What is that thing inside you?" Izuku flinched back, tears welling in his eyes. "I am not lying. I'm still me, Kaken. I'm Izuku." "No, you're not," Bakugo shouted, taking a step back as if Izuku were something contagious. "You're a freak. A monster. You died and came back wrong." He turned and ran, leaving Izuku standing alone, the cruel words hanging in the air. From that day on, everything was different. The dynamic of king and courtier was shattered. Bakugo's bullying transformed. It was no longer about superiority. It was about distance. He shoved Izuku away, not to hurt him, but to keep him at arm's length. The other children, following their leader's cue, did the same. The physical torment stopped almost entirely. No one wanted to risk pushing the boy who came back from the dead, worried about what might happen. What if they hurt him too much? What if he died again? The fear of the unknown was a more potent shield than any quirk, but it was replaced by a psychological torment that was far worse. He was ostracized. He ate lunch alone. He was the last one picked for games, if he was picked at all. The whispers followed him everywhere. "That's him. The one who fell in the river. I heard he was dead for 3 hours. He's creepy. It's not natural. What if he's a zombie?" Izuku felt the loneliness as a physical ache. He didn't understand. He was the same person. He still loved heroes. He still filled notebooks with his analysis of quirks. But the world now looked at him through a warped lens, seeing not a boy, but an aberration. His quirk, once a source of hope, became a source of shame and confusion. He started noticing the changes himself. A baseball that would have bruised another kid's hand didn't even make his palm sting. When he stumbled on the stairs at school, he landed hard on his elbow, but instead of a sharp pain, there was just a dull thud. He began to feel solid, unflinching. Late at night, he would sit in his room, the walls plastered with posters of All Might. The hero's brilliant, unwavering smile was a beacon in his darkening world. He would watch the video of his debut over and over again on his computer, memorizing every word. "It's fine now." "Why?" "Because I am here." All Might saved people. He made them feel safe. He didn't make them feel scared. He didn't make them whisper behind his back. His power was a source of universal hope, not unsettling fear. A new, fierce determination began to form in Izuku's young heart. It was a lifeline in his sea of isolation. If his quirk made people afraid, if it made them see him as a monster, then he would just have to prove them wrong. He would take this strange, unsettling power and force it to be good. He would train it, control it, and use it to save people, just like All Might. He would become a hero so great, with a smile so bright, that no one would ever have reason to be afraid of him again. He clenched his small fists, a fire in his emerald eyes that defied his loneliness. Under the skin of his knuckles, the bone was subtly thickening, becoming denser, harder. It was the first of many changes, a quiet promise from his monstrous biology. He didn't feel it, not yet. He only felt the burning desire to be a hero. He had to be. It was the only way to prove to the world, and more importantly to himself, that he was not the monster Katsuki Bakugo saw. He was Izuku Midoriya. And he was going to save everyone. The years following the incident at the creek were defined by a quiet, suffocating strangeness. For Izuku Midoriya, the world became a fragile place, made of glass and paper, and he was a stone, constantly afraid of being dropped. His first death had drawn a line in the sand of his life. On one side was a normal, happy childhood. On the other was this. This was a world where other children flinched when he walked by. Where teachers spoke to him in gentle, careful tones, as if he were a traumatized victim or an unexploded bomb, he was never sure which. It was a world where Katsuki Bakugo's explosive rage was now directed outward, at anyone who dared get too close to the walking anomaly that was his former friend. The bullying had been replaced by a fiercely enforced quarantine. Izuku's quirk, his monstrous gift, worked in the shadows of his own perception. He didn't feel the changes happening in real time. He only saw the results after the fact, small, unnerving milestones on a journey he never asked to take. The first true test after the river came when he was 7. During a particularly aggressive game of dodgeball, a boy with a minor strength enhancement quirk hurled the ball with all his might. It was aimed at Bakugo, but Izuku, in a moment of lingering, instinctual loyalty, moved to intercept it. The ball should have knocked the wind out of him, left a stinging red welt on his stomach. Instead, it hit him with a dull, fleshy thump, like a piece of fruit hitting a brick wall. The ball dropped harmlessly to the ground. Izuku didn't even stumble. The other boy stared at his own hand, then at Izuku's unmoving form, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. Bakugo, seeing this, let out a furious tch, and ended the game by blasting the ball into ashes. No one ever threw a ball that hard at Izuku again. He began to notice the small things. The jarring in his joints when he jumped from the playground equipment was gone, replaced by a smooth, shock-absorbed landing. A door he meant to close gently would slam shut with a resounding bang if he wasn't concentrating. He had to learn to write again, his grip on his pencils so powerful that he kept snapping the graphite. His mother, ever doting, just assumed he was a growing, clumsy boy. But Izuku knew better. His body was operating on a different set of rules, and he was always one step behind in learning them. His life became a series of these unsettling accidents, each one a lesson etched into his biology. At 9, he fell from a tall oak tree in his backyard. He'd been trying to retrieve a cat that had gotten stuck, his heroic instincts overriding his newfound caution. A branch, rotten from the inside, snapped beneath his feet. He fell a good 20 feet, landing flat on his back. He remembered the sensation with a horrifying clarity that would visit him in his nightmares for years to come. It wasn't just pain. It was a feeling of total, systemic failure. The snap of his own spine, the feeling of his ribs cracking and piercing his lungs, the sudden, final darkness as his brain was starved of oxygen. It was a brief, agonizing flicker of non-existence. He woke up moments later, gasping, the terrified cat hissing at him from a branch above. The grass was flattened beneath him, but his body was whole. He sat up, running his hands over his back and chest. There was no pain. Just a deep, phantom ache, a ghost of the trauma his body had already erased. That night, when he was changing for bed, he saw it in the mirror. Along his spine and over his ribs, beneath the skin, were faint, hard ridges. They were barely visible, but he could feel them when he pressed down, a lattice of bone, denser and harder than anything that should have been there. It was a subdermal cage, built by his body to prevent a repeat of its last failure. He started wearing undershirts, even in the sweltering Japanese summer, a secret armor he never wanted. At 12, the lesson became catastrophically public. He was walking home from school, his mind consumed with the details of a hero fight he'd witnessed that morning, when he stepped into the street without looking. The screech of tires was the only warning. A delivery truck, going too fast around a corner, couldn't stop in time. The impact was a detonation of sound and force. Witnesses saw the small, green-haired boy disappear under the front of the vehicle. They heard the sickening crunch of metal and bone. The truck swerved, crashing into a lamppost, its front axle bent, the windshield spiderwebbed. For Izuku, it was a maelstrom of crushing pressure and blinding pain. He felt his legs shatter, his torso compress. It was a death of overwhelming, irresistible force. The darkness that claimed him was absolute. He awoke to screaming. He was lying on the pavement a few feet from the truck. The world was a dizzying mess of noise and panicked faces. His clothes were shredded, but his body was, once again, intact. He sat up, his mind foggy, and saw the driver stumbling out of the truck, pale and shaking, staring at him as if he were an apparition. He went right under me, the driver stammered to the first onlookers. I felt the bump. Oh my God! Izuku looked down at himself. His legs were fine. His chest was fine. But he felt heavier. Denser. He pushed himself to his feet, and his hands scraped against the asphalt. On his knuckles, pushing against the skin, were small, sharp, bony protrusions. They looked like the beginnings of claws or spikes, pale and alien against his flesh. He quickly balled his hands into fists, hiding them, his heart hammering with a new and profound terror. The police and paramedics arrived, and the story became one of a miraculous quirk. Impact nullification, one of the officers wrote in his report. The boy's quirk must have activated, making him invulnerable, but Izuku knew the truth. His quirk hadn't nullified the impact. It had endured it, been destroyed by it, and then rebuilt him so it would never happen again. He hadn't survived. He had revived. This incident marked the true beginning of his fear. It wasn't the fear of pain or death. He was becoming numb to those concepts, their meanings cheapened by repetition. His fear was of the process. It was the fear of what he was becoming with each resurrection. He had fragmented memories of his deaths, sensory ghosts that haunted him. The cold rush of water filling his lungs, the sickening snap of his own bones, the crushing weight of a multi-ton truck. They were flashes of an ending, over and over, and each time he returned, a piece of the boy he was had been shaved away and replaced by something harder, something more efficient. Something monstrous. His hero analysis notebooks, once a joyful hobby, transformed into an obsession, a desperate manual for survival. The pages were still filled with sketches of heroes and notes on their ultimate moves, but now, they were accompanied by complex calculations. He studied physics, desperate to understand force distribution and kinetic energy. He memorized architectural blueprints to learn the structural weaknesses of buildings. He pored over medical textbooks, learning the precise locations of nerve clusters and pressure points. His goal was no longer simply to be a hero. It was to learn how to exist in a world he could so easily shatter. He practiced control with a monk-like focus. He learned the exact amount of pressure to apply to a doorknob without ripping it from its hinges. He learned to walk with carefully measured steps to avoid cracking the pavement. He trained himself to hold back, always, to use the absolute minimum force necessary for any task. He was living in a constant state of self-imposed restraint, a prisoner of his own indestructible body. The psychological weight was immense. He was an island, his power a stormy, uncrossable sea that isolated him from everyone. He couldn't complain to his mother. It would break her heart. He couldn't talk to his classmates. They already saw him as a freak. He couldn't even confide in his hero, All Might, who was just a smiling face on a screen. He was utterly, completely alone with his terrifying secret. By the age of 14, Izuku Midoriya was a paradox. On the outside, he was a shy, mumbling, unassuming teenager. But on the inside, he was a survivor of multiple fatal experiences, a meticulous analyst of violence, and the keeper of a body that was slowly, inexorably evolving into the ultimate weapon. The bony ridges on his back and chest were more pronounced, and the protrusions on his knuckles were permanent, forcing him to keep his hands in his pockets or curled into fists to hide them. He felt like a fraud, dreaming of saving people while trapped in a form designed for pure destruction. This was his state of mind on the day he finally met his idol. It had been a particularly bad day. His class had been discussing their future aspirations, and when Izuku had timidly mentioned his dream of going to UA High, the room had erupted in derisive laughter. His teacher had even offered a backhanded compliment, saying, "Well, Midoriya, you certainly have the constitution for it, but hero work requires more than just being hard to hurt." Then came Bakugo. After class, he'd cornered him, not with physical violence, but with words honed to a razor's edge. "Still playing hero, Deku?" He'd sneered, snatching Izuku's latest notebook. After a cursory, disgusted glance, he'd blasted it between his palms, the charred remains fluttering to the ground. "Listen up, and listen good. You're not a hero. You're a damn cheat code. A glitch. Heroes put their lives on the line. They feel fear. They can lose. You're just a rock that keeps getting back up. There's nothing heroic about that." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that cut deeper than any explosion. "If you really want to prove you have a useful quirk, why don't you take a swan dive off the roof and bet on being born with a real one in your next life?" The words struck Izuku with the force of a physical blow. Bakugo didn't know the half of it. Next life. The phrase echoed in the hollow spaces of his memory, where the feelings of snapped necks and crushed organs resided. For anyone else, it would have been a profoundly cruel taunt. For Izuku, it was a horrifyingly casual reference to the cycle of death and rebirth that defined his existence. He walked home in a daze, the scorched remains of his notebook clutched in his hand. He was so lost in his misery that he barely registered the commotion from the underpass until it was too late. A gurgling, liquid sound. A foul stench like an open sewer. Before he could react, a massive wave of green sludge erupted from a manhole cover, engulfing him. "A medium-sized invisibility cloak," the villain hissed, its voice a wet rasp. "You'll do perfectly." The sludge forced its way into his mouth and nostrils. It was thick, suffocating. Panic flared in Izuku's chest, a primal, animalistic terror. He clawed at the semi-liquid body, but his fingers just passed through it. His lungs screamed for air. The world began to swim, the edges of his vision turning dark. This was it again. Suffocation. It was a new experience. His body had armored itself against blunt force and impact, but it had never learned this lesson. As the blackness closed in, a detached, analytical part of his mind, the part he was starting to think of as it instead of him, took note. Oxygen deprivation. Cellular death initiated via asphyxiation. Current biological model insufficient. Adaptation required, anaerobic metabolism or redundant respiratory system. Then, just as the last spark of consciousness was about to be extinguished, he heard a booming voice that ripped through his fading senses. "Have no fear, you are safe. Now that I am here, that is." The manhole cover shot off its frame like a cannonball. All Might had arrived. Texas smash. The wind pressure from the punch was apocalyptic. It hit the sludge villain like a physical object, splattering its body against the walls of the underpass. Izuku was freed, collapsing to the ground, the villain's remains raining down around him. He took a deep, shuddering gasp, his lungs burning as they filled with air. His body, already kicking its regenerative process into high gear, was repairing the oxygen-starved cells at a phenomenal rate. He wasn't even dizzy. All Might was there, scooping up the villain's sludge into soda bottles, his signature smile in place. He turned to Izuku, giving him a thumbs up. "Thought we lost you there for a second. It's a good thing you're tough." Izuku was starstruck, fumbling for his ruined notebook, asking for an autograph. He was so overwhelmed by being in his hero's presence that he didn't think. When All Might prepared to leap away, Izuku did the most reckless, desperate thing he had ever done. He clung to his leg. The flight through the air was terrifying, but the conversation that followed, on a lonely rooftop overlooking the city, was infinitely worse. After All Might revealed his emaciated true form and the story of his injury, Izuku saw his one and only chance. He had to ask. He had to know if someone like him could ever truly be a hero. Even without a flashy quirk, Izuku began, his voice trembling, "Even if my power only makes me hard to kill, can I be a hero like you?" All Might looked at the boy, his skeletal face grim. He had seen the news reports over the years. The boy who survived the fall into the river. The boy who walked away from being run over by a truck. He had just witnessed him nearly suffocate to death, only to be on his feet moments later, looking more startled than harmed. "Tell me, young man," All Might said, his voice soft but heavy. "When that villain had you, when you couldn't breathe, were you afraid?" Izuku opened his mouth to give the obvious answer, but he paused. Was he? He had been panicked, yes. He had struggled. But fear? The bone-deep terror of imminent final death? He realized with a sickening jolt that he hadn't truly felt it. A part of him, the cold, analytical part, had already accepted it as another data point, another death to learn from. I didn't want it to happen, Izuku stammered, unable to lie to his idol. But I wasn't scared of dying. I was scared of what would happen after. All Might's already sunken eyes seemed to narrow. What would happen after? The floodgates broke. Izuku told him everything. Not the specifics of Doomsday or comic books, but the truth of his quirk. The deaths. The resurrections. The way his body changed, hardened, grew weapons he didn't want. He showed All Might the faint ridges on his chest and the bony protrusions on his knuckles, a confession he had never made to another living soul. Every time I die, I come back stronger, and more adapted to what killed me, Izuku finished, his voice barely a whisper, tears streaming down his face. I want to save people. I want to be a symbol of peace. But my quirk, it feels like it's built for destruction. It learns from violence. Can someone with a monster's power ever be a real hero? All Might was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the city below. The wind whistled around them. Izuku waited, his entire future hanging on the hero's response. Finally, All Might spoke, and his words were not the ones Izuku expected or wanted. They were far more terrifying. "Young man," he said, turning to face him, his expression one of profound, soul-deep concern. "Pro-heroes put their lives on the line every single day. Our mortality is what gives our sacrifice meaning. It is the understanding that life is fragile and precious that fuels our desire to protect it. It is the foundation of everything we do." He took a step closer, his gaze piercing. "I look at you, and I see a fire in your eyes. I see a heroic spirit that is undeniable. But I also see a power that terrifies me to my very core. You don't fear death. Your power treats the end of a life as a mere inconvenience, an opportunity for an upgrade." He placed a bony hand on Izuku's shoulder, his grip surprisingly firm. "So, can you be a hero? The spirit is there, without question. But you must be more careful than anyone else. You must hold on to your humanity with everything you have. Because a power that does not fear death is a power that can easily stop valuing life. Both the lives of others, and your own." He didn't say no. He didn't say, "You can't be a hero." He said something worse. He had looked into the core of Izuku's being, past the timid exterior and the heroic dreams, and he had seen the monster lurking there. He had affirmed Izuku's greatest fear. He hadn't rejected the boy. He had identified the threat. An explosion rocked the city in the distance, followed by screams. All Might cursed, looking towards the chaos. It was the sludge villain again. Bakugo. As All Might rushed to the scene, he left Izuku alone on that rooftop, the weight of his words pressing down on him harder than any truck. His idol, the symbol of peace, was afraid of him. Izuku stood there, trembling, as the sounds of the battle raged below. He watched as the heroes struggled, and as his own feet, against all reason and despair, carried him down the stairs and towards the fire. He didn't know if he could be a hero. He didn't know if he was a monster. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Kaken was in trouble. And his body, for better or for worse, was moving. The 10 months that followed his encounter with All Might were a crucible. Izuku Midoriya lived in the shadow of his idol's words, the warning echoing in his mind with the persistence of a heartbeat. A power that does not fear death is a power that can easily stop valuing life. It became his mantra, his guiding principle, and the source of a new, fanatical discipline. He had run into the fray that day, his legs moving before his mind could process the despair. He'd thrown his backpack, creating a momentary distraction that All Might, pushed beyond his limits, had used to finally defeat the sludge villain. Afterwards, in a quiet back alley, amidst the lingering scent of smoke and ozone, All Might had appeared before him once more. But he hadn't offered him a quirk. Instead, he had offered something far more profound and terrifying: his mentorship. "I saw it, young Midoriya," the skeletal hero had said, a small, grim smile on his face. "When everyone else was frozen, you, the boy with the most reason to feel hopeless, were the first to act. Your spirit is that of a true hero. Your body, however, that is a weapon of mass destruction waiting for a trigger. If you are to enter my world, the world of heroes, I will not teach you how to be stronger. I will teach you how to be weaker. I will teach you control." And so began the training from hell, a regimen designed not to build strength, but to contain it. All Might, in his true form as Toshinori Yagi, couldn't physically train Izuku in the traditional sense. Izuku was already far stronger than a man running on the fumes of a shattered organ could ever hope to be. Instead, Toshinori became his strategist, his moral compass, his engineer of restraint. Their training ground was the infamous Dagobah Municipal Beach Park, a sprawling monument to illegal dumping. But they weren't there to clean it up in the way Toshinori had once envisioned for a potential successor. For Izuku, the junkyard was a classroom. "Your problem, my boy," Toshinori explained on their first day, gesturing to a mountain of rusted appliances and discarded furniture, "is that you see the world as something to be acted upon. You must learn to see it as something to be preserved. Your task is not to clear this beach. It is to move every single piece of trash from this side to the other, without breaking anything." It was an exercise in maddening precision. Izuku had to lift a cracked television without shattering the screen. He had to disentangle a web of rebar without bending a single rod out of place. He had to move a derelict, rust-eaten car not by lifting it, but by carefully pushing it on its flat tires, applying just enough force to overcome the friction without buckling the frame. Each mistake was a lesson. An oven door ripped from its hinges by an ounce of excess force. A stack of plates reduced to dust because he hadn't accounted for their brittleness. A refrigerator he tried to lift from the top, only for its thin metal shell to crumple in his grip, the soft thump of the insulation giving way, a testament to his failure. Toshinori was a relentless teacher. Control, young Midoriya. Feel the object's resistance. Understand its breaking point. Your strength is a flood. You must learn to channel it into a single, controlled drop. Alongside the physical, there was the mental. Toshinori drilled him on ethics, on the sanctity of life, on the profound responsibility that came with power, especially power like his. They studied engineering, anatomy, and physics. Izuku's hero notebooks, once filled with ultimate moves, now contained detailed schematics of support structures and buildings, stress-strain curves for different materials, and anatomical charts highlighting the most fragile parts of the human body. He was learning how to dismantle, not to destroy, but to understand. To know exactly where to apply force to disable a threat with the minimum possible damage. His body continued its silent, inexorable evolution. After the sludge villain incident, he noticed a subtle change in his breathing. His lung capacity had increased dramatically, and he could hold his breath for over 10 minutes with little discomfort. His body, having experienced suffocation, had re-engineered his respiratory system for maximum efficiency. The bony protrusions on his knuckles became slightly more pronounced, forcing him to learn how to tape them down under his gloves during training to avoid shredding everything he touched. He lived in a state of hyper-awareness, constantly monitoring the subtle shifts in his own biology, treating his body less like a part of himself and more like a dangerous piece of equipment he was tasked with maintaining. By the time the 10 months were over, Dagobah Beach was not clean, but it was organized. Piles of scrap were meticulously sorted and stacked, a testament not to overwhelming power, but to painstaking, obsessive control. And Izuku was transformed. He was still quiet and prone to mumbling, but underneath was a core of unshakable discipline. He moved with a quiet grace, his every action deliberate and measured. He had learned how to be a feather, even though he was made of granite. He was ready for the UA entrance exam. The day of the exam arrived, a crisp, clear morning full of nervous energy. As Izuku stood before the colossal gates of UA High, he felt a tremor of anxiety, but it was overshadowed by a cold, focused calm. He saw Bakugo in the crowd, their eyes meeting for a brief, tense moment. Bakugo's expression was a complex mixture of scorn, resentment, and a flicker of something Izuku couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps it was fear. He quickly looked away, focusing on the task ahead. The written exam was a breeze, his analytical mind easily navigating the complex questions. The true test, as always, was the practical. As President Mike explained the rules in the auditorium, Izuku felt a familiar sense of detachment settle over him. Robots. 1-pointers, 2-pointers, 3-pointers. Non-sentient, designed to be broken. For most of the other examinees, this was a chance to cut loose, to show off the destructive power of their quirks. For Izuku, it was the ultimate test of his training. Could he treat even a machine designed for destruction with the careful precision Tashinori had taught him? When the gates to the practical exam site, a sprawling, detailed replica of a city, slammed open, the other students hesitated for a moment. Izuku did not. He shot forward, a silent green blur. His movements weren't explosive. They were ruthlessly efficient. He didn't waste a single motion. He encountered his first robot, a 1-pointer, as it trundled around a corner. It was a lumbering machine on tank treads, its red optical sensor swiveling to focus on him. Other students might have smashed it head-on. Izuku saw it differently. He saw its joints, its power conduits, its hydraulic lines. He didn't run. He flowed. He sidestepped the robot's clumsy lunge, his hand darting out. His fingers, strengthened to an inhuman degree, didn't punch the metal shell. They speared into the flexible joint connecting the robot's arm to its torso. With a sharp, controlled twist, he ripped the arm from its socket, severing the power cables within. The robot sparked, its arm clattering to the ground, and it froze, its single eye dimming. Deactivated. No wasted energy, no collateral damage. 1 point. He moved on, a ghost in the machine-filled city. He saw a girl with purple hair and earphone jacks on her lobes send a sonic blast that shattered a 2-pointer's chassis. He saw a boy with a naval laser blast a clean hole through another. He saw Bakugo, a whirlwind of explosions and rage, obliterating everything in his path, screaming challenges at the unfeeling machines. They were all using overwhelming force. Izuku was a surgeon. He slid under the legs of a 3-pointer, a towering bipedal machine, and drove his taped knuckles into the back of its knee joint. The joint buckled with a screech of tortured metal, and the robot crashed to the ground, helpless. He saw a 2-pointer charging another examinee and reacted instantly. He picked up a discarded piece of rebar, and with a flick of his wrist that was all carefully applied physics and no brute strength, he threw it like a spear. It sailed through the air and embedded itself in the robot's optical sensor, an instant, silent kill switch. The other examinees started to notice him. He wasn't flashy. There were no explosions, no light shows, no grand displays of power. But wherever he went, a trail of silently disabled robots was left in his wake. He was brutally, unnervingly efficient. A girl with pink skin and horns watched, wide-eyed, as he disabled 3 1-pointers in under 5 seconds, moving between them with a speed that seemed impossible for someone not actively using a speed quirk. "Whoa," she muttered to her friend. "That guy's intense." In the observation room, the mood was one of quiet disbelief. The teachers of Yui watched the monitors, their professional commentary slowly dying down as they focused on examinee 7111. "His quirk is listed as stockpile-type regeneration," Cementos noted, stroking his chin. "But he's not demonstrating any regeneration. He's not getting hit. He doesn't need to," Snipe drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Look at his form. Every strike is a disabling blow. He's not fighting them. He's dismantling them." Pinpoint accuracy. Shota Aizawa, his face impassive, stared at the screen showing Izuku's feed. He saw past the efficiency. He saw the cold, calculated precision, the complete lack of wasted motion. It was the kind of fighting style he would expect from a seasoned underground hero or a highly trained assassin, not a 14-year-old boy. There was no joy in it, no excitement. Just a task being completed. It was deeply unsettling. "He's holding back," Aizawa said, his voice a low grumble. "Immensely." Mizu, the principal, sat perched on his chair, his beady black eyes gleaming with an unnerving intelligence. "Oh, I'm well aware," he chirped, taking a sip of tea. The question is, why? All Might, in his skeletal form, stood in the back of the room, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He watched with a mixture of pride and profound dread. The boy had learned his lessons. He was demonstrating perfect control. But seeing that control in action, seeing the cold, dispassionate way Izuku dispatched the robots, only served to highlight the terrifying scale of the power he was restraining. The exam was nearing its end. Izuku had racked up a respectable 58 points through his surgical strikes. It was more than enough to pass. He was carefully detaching the leg of a two-pointer when the ground began to tremble. A shadow fell over the cityscape. A building at the end of the street crumbled, and from the dust and debris rose a mechanical titan. The zero-pointer. It was monstrous, a skyscraper-sized behemoth that dwarfed the other robots. Its purpose wasn't to be fought. It was to be an obstacle, a force of nature to be avoided. President Mick's voice boomed over the speakers. Just a wee bit of an obstacle to shake things up. I'd recommend avoiding it. The other students didn't need to be told twice. They scattered, a tide of panicked teenagers fleeing from the mechanical god. Izuku, his mission complete, turned to leave as well. He had his points. There was no reason to engage. It was the logical, controlled thing to do. Oof! A small cry of pain cut through the chaos. Izuku's head snapped around. Lying on the ground, her leg trapped under a large piece of rubble, was the kind-faced girl he had spoken to before the exam began, the one who had stopped him from tripping. Ochako Uraraka. She was directly in the zero-pointer's path. The robot's massive foot, the size of a small house, was rising, preparing to take another devastating step. In that instant, the 10 months of training, the lectures on restraint, the endless drills on control, all of it was both crystallized and rendered utterly irrelevant. Toshinori's core lesson wasn't about holding back. It was about preservation. The robots, the junk, the buildings, they were all practice. This was the real thing. A life was in danger. A cold, terrifying calm settled over Izuku. The world seemed to slow down. He analyzed the situation with the speed of a supercomputer. Distance to target, 50 meters. Robot's foot descent time, approximately 3 seconds. Rubble weight, 1.5 tons. Conclusion: he could not lift the rubble and free her in time. He had to stop the robot. Not disable it. Not dismantle it. Stop it. He took a deep breath. For the first time in almost a year, he made a conscious decision to let go of the ironclad chains he had wrapped around his power. He didn't release all of it. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that doing so would likely level the entire exam site. He released a fraction. Just a sliver. He crouched, bending his knees, pouring a fraction of his body's true potential into his legs. The asphalt around his feet didn't just crack. It splintered, webbed with 1,000 tiny fractures as the sheer density and power of his body focused on 2 small points. He didn't jump. He launched. To the other examinees, it looked like he had teleported. One moment he was a green speck 50 meters away, the next he was a rising cannonball of green and black, screaming through the air directly at the zero-pointer's colossal head. The sound barrier broke around him with a deafening crack that shattered the windows of the nearby buildings. Time seemed to dilate for Izuku in midair. He saw the robot's head, a massive construct of steel and wires. He saw the specific panel he needed to hit, the central processing unit housing. He pulled his right arm back, the taped-down protrusions on his knuckles straining against their bindings. He put everything he could into this single, decisive action. Not the unrestrained power of his death-forged body, but the perfectly focused power of his heroic will. His fist connected with the robot's face. The sound was not a simple crash or a clang of metal. It was a cataclysm. A deep, resonant boom that was felt more than heard, a shockwave of pure kinetic force that pulsed outward from the point of impact. The robot's head didn't just dent or crumple. It imploded. The metal plating vaporized, shattering into a million pieces. But the force didn't stop there. The shockwave, a visible ripple in the air, traveled down the robot's neck, into its torso, and through its limbs. It was a seismic event propagating through the machine's structure. Joints buckled. Support struts snapped. The entire gargantuan frame of the zero-pointer convulsed, a dying beast struck by a meteorite. It shuddered, groaned, and then, with the sound of a collapsing bridge, it began to fall apart, collapsing in on itself. Izuku was already falling, the recoil sending him tumbling through the air. He twisted his body, his eyes locked on Uraraka. The robot was collapsing away from her, but debris, shards of metal and chunks of concrete, was raining down. He angled his descent, positioning himself directly above her. He hit the ground with the force of an artillery shell. The pavement beneath him didn't crack, it cratered, a 5-foot-wide spiderweb of pulverized asphalt spreading from where he landed. He ignored the shattering of his own legs, a familiar, fleeting sensation of bone turning to powder that was already being undone by his hyperactive regeneration. He threw his arms out, creating a shield with his own indestructible body over the trapped girl. Chunks of metal, some the size of car doors, slammed into his back with deafening clangs, bouncing off harmlessly. When the last piece of shrapnel clattered to the ground, an eerie silence fell over the exam site. The dust began to settle. Izuku, his back smoking slightly from the friction of the impacts, pushed himself up. His legs, completely reformed, were already functional. He turned, his face a mask of cold focus, and gripped the edge of the rubble pinning Uraraka. With a smooth, controlled lift that belied the object's immense weight, he moved it aside as if it were made of cardboard. He looked down at her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady. Uraraka could only stare, her eyes wide with terror and awe. She had seen the green blur, heard the sonic boom, felt the earth-shattering impact. She had watched him fall from the sky and crater the street, then shield her from the metal rain. She wasn't looking at a boy. She was looking at a force of nature. The buzzer sounded, signaling the end of the exam. In the observation room, there was absolute, dead silence. The professional decorum was gone, replaced by slack-jawed shock. The teacup had slipped from Mise's paws, shattering on the floor. Aizawa's eyes were wide behind his goggles, all pretense of boredom gone. The other teachers were simply staring at the monitor, their minds struggling to process the raw, catastrophic power they had just witnessed. "My word," Cementos whispered, his voice hoarse. Aizawa finally found his voice, a low, dangerous growl. That wasn't a show of strength. That was a show of catastrophic force. He didn't just save her. He didn't just destroy the target. He annihilated it with absolute prejudice. He turned his gaze to the back of the room, pinning the skeletal form of All Might. "You knew. You knew he was capable of this." All Might couldn't answer. He was staring at the screen, a trickle of blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. He was proud of the boy's heroic spirit, of his immediate, selfless action, but he was utterly, profoundly terrified. He had seen what a sliver of Izuku's power could do. He couldn't begin to imagine what would happen if he ever truly lost control. The boy hadn't just punched a robot. He had punched a hole in the known scale of quirk power. As medics rushed onto the field and Recovery Girl made her way towards the scene, Izuku stood amidst the wreckage. The other students kept their distance, staring at him with a new kind of fear, one far greater than what they felt for Bakugo's explosions. He had saved a life, yes, but he had done it with a power that felt fundamentally wrong, a power that broke the rules of their world. He looked at his own hand, the tape around his knuckles torn to shreds. He had saved her. He had acted like a hero. But in doing so, he had revealed the monster. And he knew, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, that Yue Hai, and the world, would never look at him the same way again. He had passed the test, but he may have just failed at everything else. The first day of class at Yue Hai was a whirlwind of nerves and introductions. Izuku found his seat in Class 1A, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The classroom buzzed with the energy of the nation's elite, a vibrant tapestry of unique appearances and confident attitudes. He saw the serious, engine-legged boy from the exam, Tenya Ida, and the kind, round-faced girl, Ochako Uraraka, who immediately gave him a cheerful wave. He felt a small, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in years, someone was looking at him with simple, uncomplicated friendliness. Then he saw Katsuki Bakugo, slumped in his seat a few rows ahead, radiating an aura of incandescent rage. Bakugo hadn't spoken a word to him since the exam, but his glares were articulate enough. He saw Izuku's presence not just as an insult, but as a fundamental violation of the natural order. Useless, creepy Deku, the boy who came back wrong, had not only gotten into Yue, but had done so with a display of power so obscene it had overshadowed everyone else's efforts. The air between them was thick with unspoken history and simmering animosity. Izuku tried to make himself small, a habit learned over a decade of ostracization. He kept his hands balled into loose fists on his desk, a subconscious effort to hide the hard, pale protrusions that strained against the skin of his knuckles. He was a monster trying to pass as a boy, and he was terrified that at any moment, someone would see through the disguise. Their homeroom teacher arrived not with a grand entrance, but with the subtlety of a slug inching its way out of a sleeping bag. Shota Aizawa, pro-hero Eraserhead, looked them over with tired, bloodshot eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was a man who operated on pure, brutal logic, and his gaze lingered on Izuku for a fraction of a second longer than anyone else. In that fleeting moment, Izuku felt like he was being X-rayed, his every secret laid bare and found wanting. Aizawa wasted no time on pleasantries. "Put these on and meet me on the training field," he said, his voice a monotone drone as he gestured to the gym uniforms. "We're having a quirk apprehension test." The collective groan from the class was palpable. "But what about the entrance ceremony? And orientation?" Uraraka asked, her voice full of confusion. "No time to waste on pointless pleasantries," Aizawa replied without turning around. "You're here to become heroes. That starts now," he added, his voice dropping slightly. "And just so we're clear, the student who scores the lowest will be judged to have no potential and will be expelled immediately." A wave of panic swept through the students. Expelled? On the first day? It was insane. It was unfair. It was, Izuku realized with a cold certainty, a logical ruse. A way to push them to their absolute limits from the very beginning. But as he looked at Aizawa's dead serious expression, a part of him wondered if the threat was real. And if it was, he was in a unique and terrible kind of trouble. His goal today wasn't to show his limit. His goal was to show he had won. On the field, Aizawa explained the 8 tests they would be undertaking. They were standard physical fitness trials, but with a crucial difference. They were allowed to use their quirks. It was a test of power, creativity, and control. For Izuku, it was a minefield. "Bakugo," Aizawa called out, tossing him a softball. "You placed first in the practical exam. What was your best throw in middle school?" 67 meters, Bakugo grunted. "Try it with your quirk." Bakugo grinned, a feral, vicious expression. He stretched his arm, and as he threw, he let out a massive explosion from his palm. "Die!" he screamed, the word a cathartic release of his pent-up fury. The ball rocketed into the sky, propelled by a plume of smoke and fire. Aizawa's device beeped, 705.2 meters. The class erupted in cheers and exclamations of awe. This was the power of Yue. This was what it meant to be a hero in training. Izuku watched, his blood running cold. That was the benchmark. A number achieved through a spectacular, unrestrained burst of power. He, on the other hand, had to perform in a way that demonstrated skill, not just raw, terrifying force. He had to be a scalpel in a room full of sledgehammers. The first test was the 50-meter dash. Tenya Ida went first, his engines flaring to life. He covered the distance in 3.04 seconds, a marvel of biomechanical engineering. Then it was Izuku's turn, paired against the girl with a frog-like quirk. As he got into the starting crouch, he performed the mental calculations that had become second nature. He needed to be fast, but not impossibly so. No sonic booms. No cracked starting block. Just pure, controlled efficiency. The starting pistol fired. Izuku didn't explode off the line. He simply moved. There was no visible quirk activation, no surge of energy. One moment he was in the blocks, the next he was a silent green blur crossing the finish line. He ran with a preternatural grace, his feet barely seeming to touch the ground, his body a perfectly streamlined arrow. The timer read 4.13 seconds. It was an incredible time, faster than any human had a right to be, but it was achieved with an unsettling quietness. Aizawa watched, his expression unreadable. He had seen no sign of a quirk. No sparks, no glow, no transformation. The boy was just fast. Unnaturally so. Next came the grip strength test. A large, muscular student with multiple arms, Mizo Shoji, scored an impressive 540 kilograms, his 6 arms working in concert. When it was Izuku's turn, he took the device in his right hand. He could feel the cheap plastic and metal straining before he even applied pressure. This was a test of fine motor control. He began to squeeze. His focus was absolute, his eyes locked on the digital display. He watched the numbers climb rapidly. 200 kilograms, 300 kilograms, 400 kilograms. He could feel the internal mechanism of the device groaning, the metal components beginning to warp under the strain. He saw the number tick past Shoji's score, 540 kilograms. He continued to apply smooth, steady pressure. 600 kilograms, 700 kilograms, 800 kilograms. The device began to vibrate violently in his hand. He could feel the exact moment the strain on the internal sensor was about to reach its breaking point. Just as the display flickered, threatening to short out, he stopped. The final reading was a string of 9s, the machine's maximum possible output. He handed the maxed-out device back to Aizawa. A few students whistled in appreciation, but most just looked confused. Bakugo scoffed, recognizing the display of control for what it was, a condescending act of restraint. Aizawa took the device, his eyes narrowing. Any other student would have simply crushed it. Midoriya had taken it to its absolute limit, and then stopped, a feat requiring not only immense strength but an awareness of the material's integrity that was frankly absurd. The test continued in a similar fashion. In the standing long jump, he cleared the sandbox with a single, controlled leap that carried him much farther than his classmates, but landed with barely a whisper of displaced sand. In the repeated sidesteps, he was a silent, oscillating blur, his score far exceeding the others. Through it all, he remained quiet, focused, and utterly devoid of any flashy power display. He was a ghost, an anomaly performing feats that seemed to defy the very concept of quirks. He was being careful. He was being precise. And to Shota Aizawa, it was the most suspicious thing he had ever seen. Aizawa had reviewed the footage from the entrance exam a dozen times. He'd watched examinee 7111 launch himself through the air like a cruise missile, break the sound barrier, and obliterate a 10-story robot with a single punch. He'd seen the crater left by his landing. That was catastrophic, world-breaking power. This quiet, surgical efficiency was a mask, a carefully constructed facade to hide the monster underneath. Aizawa was a man who dealt with villains in the dark, men and women who hid their true intentions behind lies and misdirection. He saw the same thing in Midoriya. This wasn't a student trying his best. This was a potential threat performing a threat assessment, carefully calibrating his output to appear non-threatening. It was a lie, and Aizawa hated lies. His logical ruse of expulsion had a secondary purpose, to find the student who was a danger to the others. And right now, all his instincts were screaming that the danger was the quiet, green-haired boy who was trying so hard to appear normal. Finally, it was time for the last test. The ball throw. Uraraka had just scored an infinity symbol with her zero-gravity quirk, a feat that brought a brief moment of levity to the tense atmosphere. Now, all eyes were on Izuku as he stepped into the circle. He took the softball, its weight feeling like a pebble in his hand. He could throw it into orbit if he wanted to. He could throw it so hard it would burn up on re-entry, but he had to be smart. He needed a good score, but not an impossible one. Something that would place him high, but not so high it was unbelievable. He calculated the necessary force, the optimal angle. He would aim for just over Bakugo's score. Enough to be impressive, not enough to be terrifying. He took a deep breath and began to wind up his arm. Wait! Aizawa's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Izuku froze, his arm halfway through its motion. He looked over at his teacher. Aizawa's eyes were glowing a hellish red, his black hair floating ethereally around his head, defying gravity. His signature capture weapon writhed around his neck like living serpents. The air grew heavy. The entire class gasped. Erase her head. Someone whispered in awe. He can erase the quirks of anyone he looks at. I've been watching you, Midoriya, Aizawa said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. You've gone through every test with remarkable scores, all without a single discernible quirk activation. You're holding back. I want to see the power that destroyed the zero-pointer. I want to see what you're really capable of. His red eyes bored into Izuku. I'm erasing your quirk right now. Let's see what you can do without it. Show me your true limit. Or have you been lying to us this whole time? A wave of cold dread washed over Izuku. Erased his quirk? He focused inward, trying to feel for his power, for the simmering wellspring of strength he was always so careful to contain. But he felt nothing. There was no sensation of loss, no feeling of being weakened. But what was his quirk supposed to feel like? It wasn't a fire he could summon or engines he could ignite. It was just him. Panic began to set in. Was this his baseline? Was this all he was without his quirk? What if his normal was just normal? He would be expelled. His dream would end here. He looked at Aizawa's unrelenting gaze, at Bakugo's smug, triumphant sneer. He had to try. He had to give it everything he had. He poured every ounce of what he thought was his natural, quirkless strength into the throw. It was the same level of power he used in his daily life, the carefully moderated force he used to open a jar or carry groceries. He threw the ball. The motion was clean, simple. There was no explosion, no flash of light. But the result was anything but ordinary. The air shrieked. The ball left his hand with such velocity that it created a miniature sonic boom a few feet away from him, a sharp crack that made everyone flinch. It became a white speck in the sky in less than a second, sailing on and on, far beyond the school grounds. A profound, stunned silence descended on the field. Aizawa's hair fell back into place, his eyes returning to normal, but his jaw was clenched tight. He stared at his own hands, then back at Izuku, his face a mask of utter disbelief. The device in his hand beeped. He looked down at the screen. 705.3 meters. Aizawa's mind reeled. It was impossible. He was certain his erasure had worked. He had focused on Midoriya, felt the connection, suppressed the boy's quirk factor. He had done it hundreds of times with countless villains. It had never failed. A quirkless person could not throw a ball over 700 meters. A quirkless person could not generate a sonic boom with a throw. It defied every law of physics and biology he knew. Bakugo's face had gone from smug to apoplectic. 705.3, a single, infuriating tenth of a meter farther than his own, all-out, explosive-powered throw. And Deku had done it. Quirkless? The insult was so profound it left him speechless, his hands sparking uncontrollably at his sides. Aizawa stalked towards Izuku, his expression dark. Explain, he demanded, his voice low and threatening. I erased your quirk. I know I did. What was that? Izuku flinched, trembling under the weight of his teacher's glare. He had to tell him. He had to explain the unexplainable. Why you did erase it, sir, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I think. I didn't feel anything. Then explain the throw, problem child. That's not how it works, Izuku mumbled, looking at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. My quirk, it's not something I turn on. It doesn't give me strength. He took a shaky breath and finally met his teacher's eyes. My registered quirk is stockpile-type regeneration. But it's more reactive. Every time I suffer a major, life-threatening injury, or die, my body comes back. And when it does, it's stronger. More durable. It adapts to what hurt me. The strength, it's not an effect of my quirk, it's the result. It's what's left over. It's just my body now. It's me. The silence that followed was heavier than a mountain. The other students were too far away to hear the quiet confession, but they could feel the suffocating tension between teacher and student. Aizawa stared at Izuku, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The entrance exam. The cold, controlled precision. The fact that erasure had no visible effect. The impossible quirkless feat of strength. It wasn't a quirk in the traditional sense. A quirk was a tool, a power a person wielded. This was a biological imperative, a runaway process of adaptation and evolution. His quirk couldn't be erased because it wasn't an active power. It was a passive, biological function that had permanently and fundamentally altered the boy's physical makeup. Trying to erase his strength would be like trying to erase his green hair. It was simply a part of him. He was looking at a boy whose baseline, whose quirkless state, was that of a superhuman. A boy who, by his own admission, grew stronger through death. Aizawa felt a tremor of something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine, professional fear. His entire career, his entire fighting style, was built on his ability to level the playing field by taking away a villain's greatest weapon. Against this boy, he was powerless. His threat of expulsion suddenly seemed like the most idiotic, catastrophically dangerous idea he had ever had. What would happen if he expelled a boy with this kind of power? A boy who was clearly trying, however clumsily, to control it and use it for good? He would be creating a villain more powerful and resilient than anything he had ever faced. All for one would be a minor threat compared to what this boy could become if his spirit was broken, if he was cast out and left to fester in resentment. The logical ruse had worked. He had found the student with the most potential. But it was a terrifying, limitless, and utterly unmanageable potential. The most logical course of action now was containment, observation, guidance. Keeping him at UA, under his direct supervision, was no longer just an educational duty. It was a matter of national security. He turned to face the rest of the class, his face an impassive mask that betrayed none of the turmoil raging within him. The test is over. The scores will be on the board tomorrow, he announced, his voice back to its usual monotone. And the expulsion threat was a logical ruse. It was to push you to do your best. A wave of relieved sighs and angry shouts filled the air. Aizawa ignored them. He walked past Izuku, pausing for a moment to speak in a low voice only he could hear. You're not expelled, Midoriya. But don't think for a second that this is over. Your test has just begun. We have a lot to talk about. Izuku watched him go, his body trembling with a mixture of relief and dread. He was in. He had survived the first day. But his secret was out. His teacher didn't see him as a student. He saw him as a problem, a monster to be managed. The path to becoming a hero had just become infinitely steeper. The days following the quirk apprehension test settled into a tense, fragile routine. Shota Aizawa had kept his word. He hadn't expelled Izuku, but he had placed him under a microscope. Every action Izuku took, every answer he gave in class, every movement he made in training was scrutinized by his homeroom teacher's tired, calculating eyes. It was a constant, unnerving pressure that forced Izuku to maintain his ironclad control at all times. His classmates, for their part, treated him with a strange mixture of awe and caution. News of his 705.3-meter quirkless throw had spread like wildfire, cementing his reputation as the class's resident enigma. He was no longer just the boy who destroyed the zero-pointer. He was the boy whose baseline strength rivaled the flashiest of quirks. He found an unexpected camaraderie with Uraraka and Ida, whose genuine kindness managed to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. For the first time, he felt something akin to friendship. But across the classroom, a storm was brewing. Katsuki Bakugo was a volcano on the verge of eruption. He had witnessed the ball throw with his own eyes. He had seen the quiet, impossible feat that had casually surpassed his own all-out effort. The world, as he understood it, was broken. For his entire life, he had been the pinnacle, the apex predator of their small world. Deku was the pebble beneath his boot. But now, the pebble had become a mountain, one that had appeared overnight and blocked out the sun. He replayed his memories, searching for an explanation, and found only contradictions. The useless, quirkless Deku he had tormented. The creepy, unkillable Deku who had survived the river. The monstrously powerful Deku who had obliterated a giant robot. And now, this controlled, infuriatingly precise Deku who could outperform him without even trying. It wasn't just that Deku was strong. It was that his strength felt like a cheat, an unearned, unnatural power that made a mockery of Bakugo's own hard-won skill. His frustration festered, turning into a white-hot, consuming rage. He needed to understand. He needed to prove that his power, his explosions, his will to win, was superior to whatever freakish aberration resided within Izuku. He needed to make Deku feel fear. He needed to see him bleed, to see him break, to force him to acknowledge Bakugo's superiority. He needed a fight. He got his wish during their first foundational heroics class, taught by the booming, larger-than-life figure of All Might himself. The class was Battle Trials, a 2-on-2, indoor combat simulation pitting heroes against villains. As the lots were drawn, a cruel twist of fate sealed their confrontation. Izuku was paired with Ochako Uraraka as the hero team. Katsuki Bakugo was paired with the steadfast Tenya Ida as the villain team. They were the first matchup. Their arena, a multi-story building mock-up, with a papier-mâché nuclear weapon hidden somewhere inside. As they stood in the prep room, Uraraka was buzzing with a nervous energy. Wow, we're up against Bakugo and Ida. Bakugo was first in the exam. He's amazing. We need a good plan. Izuku barely heard her. His entire focus was on the monitor showing the villain team entering the building. He saw the look on Bakugo's face. It was not the look of a student participating in a training exercise. It was the look of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. This wasn't a trial for Bakugo. This was a reckoning. Uraraka-san, Izuku said, his voice low and serious, pulling his gaze away from the screen. Bakugo, he's not going to be focused on the objective. He's going to come for me. He's been my classmate since we were kids. I know how he thinks. His pride is everything. He'll see this as a personal battle. He took a deep breath, the lessons of his 10 months with Tashinori surfacing in his mind. Analyze. Strategize. Control. Here's the plan, he said, spreading a blueprint of the building on the table. He'll abandon Ida and the bomb to hunt me down. That's our opening. You will be our win condition. Your job is to find Ida and the weapon while I keep Kaken busy. Avoid fighting him at all costs. Just find the objective. I'll handle him. Uraraka looked at him, her round face full of concern. Handle him? But he's so strong. And, you're going to call him Kaken? Even now? It's just a habit, Izuku mumbled, a faint flush on his cheeks. He met her gaze, his emerald eyes holding a grim seriousness that seemed far too old for his face. Please. Just trust me. Do not engage him. As the buzzer sounded for the start of the match, Izuku and Uraraka entered the building. The air inside was cool and smelled of paint and fresh drywall. The hallways were a labyrinth of blind corners and potential ambush points. Izuku immediately took the lead, his senses on high alert. In the monitor room, All Might watched with a growing sense of unease. He knew the history between the two boys, and he could see the dangerous intensity simmering in young Bakugo. Pay close attention, class, he boomed, trying to maintain a cheerful, educational tone. A hero must be prepared for a foe who is driven by personal grudges. How will young Midoriya handle such a direct and aggressive assault? He didn't have to wait long. They had only made it to the second floor when a figure shot out from a side corridor, a blur of orange and black. It was Bakugo, his movements propelled by small, precise explosions, a shark cutting through the water. His gauntlets were already aimed, his face twisted into a feral grin. DKU! He roared, unleashing a powerful right hook, his palm already crackling with energy. Izuku reacted with a speed that was purely instinctual. He shoved Uraraka behind him and sidestepped, the explosive punch missing him by inches and blasting a chunk of concrete out of the wall behind them. The concussive force washed over him, hot and violent. Uraraka, go! Izuku yelled, not taking his eyes off Bakugo. Find the bomb. Now! Uraraka hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her expression determined. She activated her quirk on herself and floated quietly up a stairwell, disappearing from sight. Now, it was just the two of them. The air crackled with tension. So you sent your sidekick away, Bakugo sneered, smoke curling from his palms. Good. I didn't want any distractions. Now talk. Where did you get that power? You were a worthless, quirkless pebble, and now you look at me like you're better than me. Hiding your power all those years, laughing at me behind my back. You're wrong, Kaken, Izuku said, his voice steady as he fell into a defensive stance. I never lied. My quirk only manifested when I was 4, but it's not the kind of thing you can show off. You wouldn't have understood. Oh, I understand just fine. Bakugo spat, launching himself forward again. I understand that you're a liar and a cheat. And I'm going to blast that smug, controlled look right off your face. What followed was not a fight. It was a masterclass in evasion. Izuku never threw a single punch. He became a ghost, flowing around Bakugo's explosive assault like water around a rock. He used the capture tape Aizawa had given them, a tool he had become surprisingly adept with. As Bakugo lunged, Izuku would duck and weave, the white tape shooting out to wrap around Bakugo's leg, using his own momentum to throw him off balance. Bakugo was a force of pure, unrestrained offense, each explosion a cannon blast that tore up the hallway. He was faster, more agile, and his combat instincts were honed to a razor's edge. Against any other opponent, he would have been utterly dominant. But Izuku was not any other opponent. His mind, trained by All Might and his own obsessive analysis, was processing Bakugo's attack patterns, predicting his movements, identifying the subtle tells in his posture before each blast. More than that, his body was simply better. His reaction time was faster. His movements were more efficient. He didn't have to worry about the concussive force of near misses. His dense body absorbed the shockwaves with ease. He was a perfect defensive machine, and it was driving Bakugo insane. Stand still and fight me! Bakugo bellowed, his frustration reaching a fever pitch. He was landing hits on the walls, the floor, the ceiling, everywhere but on Izuku. I don't have to, Izuku replied, panting slightly as he dodged another blast. I'm not here to fight you, Kaken. I'm here to win the trial. My goal is to capture you or secure the weapon. That's what a hero does. His words, calm and logical, were like gasoline on a fire. To Bakugo, it was the ultimate insult. Izuku wasn't even taking him seriously as a threat. He was treating him like an obstacle, a puzzle to be solved. You think you're better than me, Bakugo whispered, his voice dangerously low. He came to a stop, his whole body trembling with a rage so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air. He slowly raised his right arm, aiming the massive, grenade-shaped gauntlet directly at Izuku. A small pin was near the handle. You know what these are, Deku? My gauntlets store my nitroglycerin like sweat, and this pin here. In the monitor room, All Might's blood ran cold. Young Bakugo, don't! He shouted into the comms. You'll kill him. You'll destroy the entire building. He won't die if he dodges. Bakugo screamed back, his voice cracking with fury, his thumb resting on the pin. He was looking at Izuku, his red eyes full of a desperate, hateful need for validation. You look down on me, don't you? With that stupid, unkillable body of yours. You think you can take anything I can dish out? Well, can you take this? Izuku's eyes widened. He saw the fury in Bakugo's eyes, the complete loss of control. He wasn't bluffing. This was it. The culmination of a decade of resentment and fear, about to be unleashed in a single, catastrophic blast. He had a split second to make a choice. He could dodge. His body was more than fast enough to clear the blast radius. But the explosion would tear through the entire floor, possibly compromising the building's structure and endangering Uraraka and Ida above. It was what a survivor would do, but a hero stands their ground. A hero protects. Bakugo, stop! He yelled, but it was too late. Say hello to pain! Bakugo roared, and pulled the pin. The world dissolved into fire and thunder. A massive, concentrated beam of explosive energy erupted from the gauntlet. It was not a simple blast. It was a focused, directional explosion, a shaped charge designed for maximum destruction. It consumed the hallway, incinerating the air, blasting concrete and steel into dust. Izuku stood his ground. He crossed his arms in front of his chest in a desperate, instinctual block, bracing himself. The blast hit him like a physical fist the size of a train. The heat was beyond anything he had ever experienced, a searing, flaying agony that vaporized his hero costume instantly. The force was absolute, a tidal wave of pure kinetic energy that picked him up and slammed him through the wall behind him, then the next wall, and the next. For a brief, terrible moment, he was aware of his own disintegration. He felt his arms, the ones shielding his face, turn to ash. He felt the flesh being scoured from his bones, his ribcage cracking and collapsing inward, his organs rupturing from the concussive pressure. It was a death of fire and force, absolute and overwhelming. Then, the darkness took him. In the monitor room, the students screamed. The camera feed from the hallway had gone to static, completely wiped out by the blast. All they could see was the external view of the building, where a massive hole had been blown clean through the side, smoke and flames pouring out. All Might was frozen, his skeletal hand gripping the console so hard it cracked. "Young Bakugo, what have you done?" he whispered, his voice filled with horror. He had failed. He had allowed his students' rivalry to escalate into this. He was about to call off the match, to rush to the scene himself, but Kirishima's sharp voice cut through the panic. "Wait! Look!" he shouted, pointing at the dust-filled hole in the building. A figure was standing there, silhouetted against the fires within. Bakugo stood in the ruined hallway, panting, his ears ringing, his arm aching from the recoil. The entire section of the building was a smoldering wreck. He had done it. He had hit him with everything he had. There was no way, no possible way anyone could have survived that. A grim, hollow satisfaction settled in his chest. He had finally won. He had proven his power was absolute. I told you, he gasped, smoke still curling from his gauntlet. Then, a voice, raspy and strained, echoed from the wreckage. "Is that all you've got, Kaken?" Bakugo's eyes widened in disbelief. He stared into the swirling smoke and dust. The silhouette took a step forward, then another. As the smoke cleared, Bakugo felt a primal fear, colder and sharper than anything he had ever known, clutch his heart. Izuku stood there, in the epicenter of the destruction. His hero costume was gone, incinerated, leaving him in only the tattered remains of his shorts. His body was a horror show. The skin on his arms and chest was blackened and charred, great patches of it sloughing off to reveal the muscle and bone underneath. A gaping, smoldering crater was burned into his torso, right where the blast had hit him square on. His left arm was completely gone from the elbow down, but he was standing. And as Bakugo watched in speechless terror, the impossible began to happen. The charred flesh began to knit itself back together. Smoke, thick and white, poured from his wounds as his cells, hypercharged with a frantic biological imperative, began to regenerate at an unnatural rate. The gaping hole in his chest filled in, new muscle fibers weaving themselves together, fresh skin crawling over the new tissue. His missing forearm began to regrow, first as a stump of raw flesh, then elongating, bone and sinew and muscle sprouting forth in a grotesque, accelerated mockery of life. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. As his body healed, it changed. Underneath the new skin, something was growing. Hard, gray, bony plates began to form, pushing up from within. They traced the lines of his ribs, his sternum, his collarbones, creating a visible, segmented carapace of organic armor across his torso. Similar plates formed over his forearms and shoulders. His body, having been annihilated by fire and explosive force, was rebuilding itself to be immune to them. It was a suit of armor grown from his own DNA. Izuku looked down at his rapidly reforming body, a look of profound, soul-deep exhaustion and horror on his face. He felt the phantom pain of every burned cell, every shattered bone. He felt the cold, alien sensation of the bony plates settling into place beneath his skin. This was the cost of his heroism. This was the price of standing his ground. Another piece of his humanity had been burned away and replaced by something monstrous. He looked up, his green eyes locking with Bakugo's terrified red ones. There was no anger in his gaze. No thirst for revenge. Only a vast, weary sadness. "I win," Izuku said, his voice raspy but clear. He turned his back on the horrified Bakugo and began to walk unsteadily towards the stairs. Hero team wins. He didn't need to fight anymore. Bakugo was broken. His ultimate attack, his symbol of absolute power, had been tanked. He had killed his rival, and he had watched him resurrect, stronger and more monstrous than before. The foundation of his world had been shattered. He had wanted to make Deku feel fear, but instead, he had been shown a truth so terrifying it had broken his spirit. He sank to his knees amidst the rubble, his gauntlet falling from his limp hand with a heavy clang. Upstairs, Uraraka had found Ida and the weapon. Hearing the colossal explosion, she had used it as a distraction, floating herself and a piece of debris above the unsuspecting Ida and dropping it. As he dodged, she used her quirk on the weapon itself and floated it out of his reach, securing the victory for the hero team just as Izuku's voice came over the comms. Izuku made it to the doorway of the bomb room just as Recovery Girl and a team of medics arrived, All Might close behind. He saw Uraraka, safe and sound. He saw Ida, unharmed. He had done it. He had protected them. Then, the adrenaline that had kept him standing faded, and the sheer biological cost of his regeneration hit him like a tidal wave. An overwhelming exhaustion, a cellular debt of unimaginable proportions, washed over him. His newly reformed legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor, unconscious before he hit the ground. The last thing he was aware of was the horrified look on All Might's face, a look that confirmed his deepest fear. He had won the battle. He had protected his friends. He had acted like a hero. But in the process he had shown them all, without a shadow of a doubt, the monster that lived inside him. And that, he knew, was a loss from which he might never recover.